Okay, when my dad was about 20 years old, it was the height of the Vietnam War, and he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. And part of it was, he told me at one point, he said, the truth is, I was pretty sure I was going to get drafted at some point, and I was not going to be the guy, I couldn't pull off the jungle thing, you know what I'm saying? So he enlisted in the Air Force in the hopes of getting a job that he could really do. So he and his brother enlisted in the Air Force. He went through basic training. He graduated top of his class at basic training. He took some tests and, was the highest scoring test, so he kind of got his pick, and so he became a Russian linguist. He went into the military intelligence, and so they flew him off to Syracuse, and so he spent 10 months in Syracuse learning Russian, 10 months. It was 16 hours a day. No one was allowed to speak English for 10 months. But not only that, not only was no one else allowed to speak English, but when you were off the base, you weren't allowed to speak Russian, because he also had to have a top secret code word clearance, which meant that he knew a lot of important information. And so there's top secret is one level, but top secret code word means not only do you know the information, but you know where the information came from. And so you have to be really careful. They don't want anybody to know that you speak Russian. So he goes through 10 months of training, and then they ship him off to Nebraska, where he's going to kind of spend most of his time. And he joins a team that was an interesting team. He joins a group of people that were going to try to figure out what was going on with the Russian air defense system. Let me explain for a second. Can you picture in your brain Russia? It's a huge country, right? I mean, it's a huge country, especially its northern border up against the Arctic Ocean. It's just this vast territory. And the reality was, most people didn't know, but Russia didn't have enough radar to cover the entire northern border. And so what they did was they put the radar that they did have, they put it on trains. And then they would move those trains randomly so that the U.S. wouldn't know where they could go through without being detected. You following with me here? So here's what my dad did. My dad and a bunch of other guys would get into a C-130. That's a big cargo plane. He'd get into a C-130, and remember, this is the late 60s, so it was filled with computer equipment, like top to bottom, the whole big thing, filled with computer equipment, all of which probably doesn't do what my phone does right now. But just a ton of equipment. They get in the back of this plane, and they would take off from Nebraska, and they would fly over the Arctic Circle, over the Arctic Ocean, and they would fly directly toward the Russian border. And they would go real low, down onto 200-300 feet off of the Arctic Ocean, and they would go perpendicular, directly toward the Russian border. And about 15 or 20 miles before the Russian border, they would pop up. And my dad's job was to have in his ears he was able to listen in to the radio frequencies of the air traffic control, of the other airplanes that are coming, and his job is to listen in Russian to figure out what's really going on. So most of the time what happens is they would fly at the coast, and they would pop up, and all of a sudden they would hear crackle, crackle. We have a contact. They would scramble fighters, MiGs. And they would scramble fighters to go out there and make sure that they knew what this thing was, and they would see that it was. And if that happened, today we know there's radar here. You following with me? Sometimes they would fly at the border, they would pop up and nothing. Today, if Russia launches missiles at us, here's where we go at them. You following with me here? Everybody with me? I think that's a pretty cool mission, isn't it? I was like, when my dad told me about this, I was like, that is so stinking cool. Because here's the thing. We all know, either from history or some of you were around at the time and maybe from the news. I will not point you out. But the Vietnam War, our enemy really wasn't Vietnam. I mean, sure, in the jungles of Vietnam, the people holding the guns were the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese, But our enemy, it was the middle of the Cold War. Our enemy was Russia, right? But here's the problem. The United States and Russia couldn't go to war against each other because we knew we'd pretty much destroy each other completely. And so we fought this war in Vietnam that we call a proxy war, right? It's a war that we're fighting each other. They are arming and assisting the Viet Cong, and we are arming and assisting and even fighting alongside the Viet Minh. And so we're fighting this war, but we're not really fighting a war. And it was called a proxy war. And I bring all of that up today to help us understand a little something, because I believe that you and I are in a proxy war, and we don't even know it. And it's a perfect day to do it. If you noticed, we got a little baptismal over here. We're super excited. We got a bunch of people getting baptized. I think at least 3 at this service and 4 at next service, and we're excited about that. But I wanted to talk about this war that we're involved in, because I think, as they get down into the waters of baptism, as they say, Jesus is mine, I am his, as they do it, it's not just a nice fun thing that we all get to clap for and then you leave. You may not know it, but when you got in the baptistry, you signed up for war, for a proxy war. And Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, talks about this proxy war. And here's how he says it. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. Now, when you hear the word armor, that probably doesn't bring up the connotations of war for you. But if you were reading it at the time that Paul wrote it, it would be all about war. Armor is all about war. Paul is absolutely talking about war, but he's talking about a proxy war. Listen, he says, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. It is clear that Paul is saying that our enemy in this war is not people. It's not flesh and blood. The battle isn't against people. That's the first thing we got to understand about this proxy war. The battle isn't against people. I'm telling you, it is so hard to see past the here and now, the physical, the right in front of us. It is so hard to see past it, to see behind the scenes as to what's really going on. You might have thought in the Vietnam War that we were fighting the Vietnamese, but that's not really what was happening. There was something bigger, something deeper going on. The same is true for us, because there is all of this painful and distracting stuff that happens in regular life. And so we think that that this flesh and blood stuff is our real enemy, but we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. And so this is a different kind of war. I want us to get into as we talk about this war. It is a different kind of war, and the truth is the war is just an analogy. It's very little to do with war, actually. But since Paul uses war as his analogy, so will we. But before we get into what this war actually looks like, I want to give you 4 things that it is not. 4 things that the war that Paul is talking about, this proxy war that we're in, is not. Number 1, this war is not a culture war. We are not, our job is not to push back against the grain, to protect our traditional values. Our call is not to yell out at anybody who disagrees with us and try to get them to stay back into the old, like we always, you hear people say, oh man, I wish it was the 1950s again. That was back when life was good, right? Well, if you're white, right? The 1950s was great if you were white. But the truth is, here's what we know. Holding on to what was is not the point of this war. This is not a culture war. Number 2, this is not a religious war. It is not us against the Hindus or the Buddhists or the Muslims. It is not a Christian country up against a radical Islamic fundamentalist. That's not the war. It is not our little version of religion against the Catholics or against the Methodists. It is not a religious war. It is also not a political war. It is not about the political will of our country. It is not about Republicans. It is not about Democrats. It's not even about issues, though I have lots of issues that I feel very strongly about. That's not what this war is about. It's not a political war, but this last one I think is the hardest. It's not a relational war. You see, it is easy to be lured into believing that your enemy is the creep at work who says all the inappropriate things. It's easy to be lured into thinking that your enemy is the teacher who mistreats your kid, or that it's your ex-wife, or that your enemy is your in-laws, or any other mean person in the world. But we have to remember that our enemy is not flesh and blood. People are not the ones that we're fighting in this war, because it is a proxy war. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. This is not a culture war. It's not a religious war. It's not a political war. It's not a relational war. It is a spiritual war. And the players, I'm going to say some weird stuff now. Kellen said that it's not weird stuff in church. I'm about to get weird. Okay? Because the players in this war sound like a sci-fi movie, right? We're talking about Satan himself. We're talking about demons. We're talking about angels. Those are the players in this war. And I got to tell you, if you walked into this place and you're not even sure what you thought, maybe you just came to see somebody get baptized, and you think, what the heck is wrong with these people? And you think, oh, you guys seem to be educated people. How could you possibly believe in all these fairy tale things? And I get that. And I don't have a bunch of evidence to show you. But the truth is, spiritual things don't have evidence. That's the nature of spiritual things. And so we ask, why would you possibly believe in? And here's what I'll tell you. Here's all I've got. I don't have a bunch of evidence. But here's what I've got. Jesus believed in it. And I believe that of all people who have ever lived in all of the history of the world, I believe that Jesus had incredible insight into the spiritual world. Probably because he was God and stuff. But he had incredible insight into the spiritual world, which then he spoke about. And so for me, I just decided a long time ago that if Jesus is going to say something about the spiritual world, I'm just going to believe it. Because he's got a whole lot more understanding about that than I do. Sure, is it weird? Yeah. But if Jesus believes it, so do I. And I understand that may not be enough for you, and that's okay. Can I tell you that? It's okay that you're not quite sure whether you believe everything that we say up here on this stage. That's okay. We hope that this is a place that you can feel connected to and feel comfortable at, whether you agree with us about a bunch of stuff or not. But I want to get back to this spiritual war, because if there is a spiritual proxy war going on in the heavenlies, then we've got to learn how to fight that war. Does anybody here know exactly how to fight a spiritual war? Have you read any books about it? The truth is, I wouldn't have a clue how to fight a spiritual war except for this little chunk of Scripture, which is why this is such an important series that we're in as we dig into this Ephesians chapter 6, this part of the letter that Paul wrote to the Ephesians that gave us an understanding of this battle. And so that's why we're doing this battle ready series. But so now, before I go into what this looks like. Don't get too excited. If you were thinking about going to get a crucifix and some holy water and do some exorcism, that probably isn't what we're talking about here. But the truth is, a spiritual battle calls for spiritual weapons. And so Paul lists some spiritual weapons, and he makes them analogous to weapons of war. And so he talks about the belt of truth and the breastplate of righteousness and the gospel of peace and the shield of faith and the helmet of salvation and the word of God. And if you notice, every single one of those weapons don't sound like weapons. Truth, righteousness, peace, faith, salvation. Those don't sound like weapons. You can't truth somebody to death. There's no faith missile we can aim. Doesn't sound like weapons of war. And so we think, what does it look like? The truth is, we have very little understanding of how this proxy war is fought. And then, after he lists all these things, then he says, this is what Paul says, he says, at every opportunity, pray in the Spirit with every kind of prayer. And so this must be where he's talking about this weapon. Like this prayer is our big weapon that we're going to wield against the enemy. And then maybe the louder I pray, or the more eloquently I pray, or the more confidently I pray, somehow that has more power. A lot of us think that. But the truth is, prayer, I'm going to say something that you may disagree with, and I understand. It's okay to disagree with this. But the primary purpose of prayer isn't to change things. I believe this. I know there are good Christian, smart Christian people who will disagree with me on this. That's okay. But in my understanding, the primary purpose of prayer is not to change things, though it can, and it does. I mean, there's no way around that. I believe in the power of prayer. You look at James chapter 5, it says, the earnest prayer of a righteous man accomplishes much. That means it does stuff. It changes things. So I'm not pretending that it doesn't change things, but I don't think that's the primary purpose of prayer. Prayer is about putting me in my place so that God can take his rightful place. That's the primary purpose of prayer. Prayer is not about exerting our power. It's about submitting ourselves completely to God so that his power can be unleashed in the spiritual world. And so tonight our church is going to be down in Beloit and praying. And then maybe a lot of people might think, hey, yeah, we're gathering together. We're pulling together. We're pooling our power so that we can fight back. But the truth is, what we really need to do tonight, what we're going to do tonight is instead of using our power to fight, we are going to submit ourselves to God himself. Because we don't know how to fight this battle. There's only one person who does. And so the purpose of prayer is not to wield power. It's to submit to the one who has the real power. So John the Baptist was in the Jordan River. I baptized people in the Jordan River about a year and a half ago. And I was just telling a couple of people about that before the service. I baptized people in the Jordan River, and it was freezing. And there were fish that were biting like insane. Like, it was like, like when you put you see the people who put their feet in and the fish eat all the dead skin off their feet. That was not my plan, but that's what it was. And it was like, so I had like 13 people I was baptizing, and I looked like I had to go to the bathroom the whole time, because I'm like, get off of me, stupid fish. So John the Baptist is baptizing people, and in my brain, he's getting eaten alive, right? So he's baptizing people, and up walks Jesus. And John knows who Jesus is. John knows Jesus isn't just another dude coming to get baptized. John knows he is the Messiah. John knows that he is God. And I wonder if John was like, what the heck are you doing, Jesus? You don't need to get baptized. You're like God and stuff. Why would you get baptized? But here's the truth. Jesus knew. Jesus knew that there was a battle coming. And he ended up right after that going into the wilderness. And guess who he fought? Satan himself. Jesus knew that there was a battle coming. And so he went into the waters of baptism like some of you guys are going to do today. He went into the waters of baptism to prepare himself, to enlist himself in this battle. But to do it in a way, because we all know, he didn't have to do that, but he did it for a couple of reasons. Number one, to model for us what it means to enlist ourselves in this battle. And number two, Jesus modeled for us the humility of being baptized even though he didn't have to. He could have said, I don't need this. I'm God. But he didn't. He humbled himself because he knew that the test was coming. He knew that earthly battles are won by strength and strategy, but spiritual battles are won by humility and submission. Can I say that again? Earthly battles, the ones that we are familiar with, are won by strength and strategy. But when we are involved in a spiritual battle, the spiritual battle, it's not about strength, it's not about power, it's won by humility and submission. And this truth that Jesus believed would be tested on the cross. He hung there on that tree between two criminals, and one of them said, hey, if you are who you say you are, save yourself, right? Save yourself. Save us. Use your power. Take your rightful throne, right? That makes so much sense. The first time you look at the story of Jesus, you think, man, any minute, he could have stopped all of this. But he didn't. He could have used his power, but he didn't, because he knew that earthly battles are won by strength and strategy, but spiritual battles are won by humility and submission. And so Jesus humbled himself to the point of death, and he submitted himself to the cross, and that's how we got victory. That's how spiritual battles are won. It's like the opposite of what we think, how we think things should go. Spiritual battles are won by submission. I don't know what your struggle is today. I don't know what you came with. I don't know how painful your life is. I don't know. You know, I talked to a couple of you guys at when you first walked in, and it was like, hi. You know, and here's my thing. Sometimes I'm just tired, but sometimes there's a lot behind that high. Sometimes there's a lot of pain behind that high. I don't know what's going on in your life. I don't know how life is hard for you right now. But here's what I do know. Your enemy isn't flesh and blood. I know that's hard to believe because the flesh and blood is so distracting. The jerk that you have to deal with is so distracting. The disease that you have to deal with is so distracting. The financial struggle that you have to deal with is overwhelming. It is so hard to see it. But I just wanted to remind you today that your enemy isn't flesh and blood, even though it feels like it is. But what I wanted to remind you of is when we think that what we're supposed to do is fight the flesh and blood, we think about all the wrong weapons. Because a spiritual battle calls for spiritual weapons. Your battle isn't won by figuring things out, by being smarter than the other guy, by being the person willing to do the extra work. The battle is won in humility and submission. My dad, I remember when I was growing up, my grandma and my dad would have these arguments. My dad's mom. My grandma and my dad would have these arguments because my grandma desperately wanted to know how my dad got one of the highest medals that an Air Force airman could ever have. Desperately wanted to know, but my dad, for 25 years, could never tell her because it was all top secret. He never told us about any of those missions. It was all top secret. So we went most of our lives, and just before my grandma died, my dad opened Time magazine. And all of his missions, everything that he did was a huge spread, 20-some page spread in Time magazine. He's like, well, I guess I can tell you about it now, right? So my grandma, she had held on to his medal her whole life. He didn't care that much about it, but she held on to it his whole life, and she never knew what he did. Well, so he got to tell us the story. One day, they got in the plane, doing their normal thing. They flew low, right at the Russian border. They popped up, and the radio crackled to life, and he heard them scramble the MiGs the way that they always did, and the MiGs would always come right up alongside them and make sure that they knew what it was, make sure they know that, and then they would fly off. And so this was just like every time he came up alongside, the MiG did, and he's listening in on the radio chatter, and the MiG at some point turned around and came in behind. I thought, that's weird. And my dad heard over the radio, "You are clear to fire." And my dad, he hit a button, and I'm not going to tell you, because it was the military, what it was. We're going to call it the oh no button. Do you hear what I'm saying? Everybody with me? Kaboom! And the plane dives down to and they dive as low as they can possibly dive, and they turn, and they do their absolute best, and the truth was, that MiG could have fired at any minute. It's a C-130. It can't outrun a MiG, but they decided not to fire. And so my dad got a medal. He says, I got a medal for saving my own behind. That's all I did. He said, my grandma just thought he must have done the most amazing thing to get this medal. And my dad was like, I didn't care about it because I just got a medal to save my own butt. My dad never thought that he was the truth is, I got to be honest with you, I think my dad's a hero. I think he's a hero. I couldn't be more proud to have a dad who served his country that way. But he didn't think he was a hero. He just thought, I'm just a little guy in a big war, doing his little duty. That's it. And I just want to say, I think there is this sense that we could get all excited about this war because we want to be heroes. Because we want to be the hero. We want to do the work. I got to say, everybody who's getting into that baptistry, we don't get baptized. Those of you who have been baptized in your life, we didn't get baptized so that we could become these super fighters and get medals because we're so amazing. It's not about becoming a hero. We don't pray on every occasion with every kind of prayer so that we can exert power. We enlist in the battle, and we submit in prayer because we believe in the one who really is the hero. There's a hero. But thank him that it is not us. We enlist because we believe in him, and so we can play our small role in this huge, epic proxy war that we're living every day. We think it's about people. It's not about people. We think that life is hard because people are mean. The truth is, life is hard because this world is fallen, and there is a war going on. And the more we fight flesh and blood, the more difficult it will be. We gotta learn to see past the flesh and blood, to see the spiritual war, remind ourselves that a spiritual war calls for spiritual weapons, and allow ourselves to be humble and to submit to the power and the will of God himself. Would you pray with me? Father in heaven, there's something in me that wants to play the hero, but I am so grateful that you are the real hero. Thank you so much for sending your son. Thank you for drawing me to you. Thank you for drawing my friends to you. And Lord, would you remind us to see past the flesh and blood, to get a sense of the eternal. We love you. We worship you in Jesus' name. Amen.